Hey everyone, welcome back. And today I'm gonna be doing what if the People's Democratic Republic of Korea, also known as North Korea, decides to form an empire. So, the first thing that they would do is elect a president that is imperial. So, they would try to search for allies since they're surrounded by China and American allies, which is South Korea and Japan. So they go over to Central Asia. They manage to get Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Tajikistan, and Kyrgyzstan. And they go to Southeast Asia, where they recruit Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. And I guess let's just throw in Indonesia as well. So what the North Korea would do is try to become Korea altogether, unifying with the South against any communist government. So with North Korea could go for South Korea first, but at the same time that could just lead it to the Americas joining, officially leading into the Second Korean War. So what they do first is that they go over to Taiwan and go to ask them and say that they will help them defeat China, but in return they would have to pay them some compensation for taking some of their land, but they would be able to give the Chinese territory back over to Taiwan once the war was over. So Taiwan decides to lean towards the North Koreans, and they all declare war on China. So with China having to fight three fronts at once, they would try to focus on the North Korean border. So what they would do is the North Koreans would start quickly invading Manchuria, and then once the Chinese are busy with the North Koreans, Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan would work together to start advancing into the western part of China, as alongside with Uzbekistan and Tajikistan. So with this, they managed to get over to Nepal, and then they managed to get inside Tibet, and then soon the Chinese would have to leave the North Korean front to fight off with the Central Asian countries. So with this, they managed to push him back and push back the North Korean front a bit, eventually back to their border. And then in Southeast Asia, with the Indonesian troops that coming in, they invade this island and then start going in. And then with China being prepared at the Strait of Taiwan, they already take out Taiwan. And then eventually they starting to go over to Bhutan in Southeast Asia, and then eventually they connect with Nepal, and then with the Central Asian finally connecting up with the Southeast, they manage to make one big front, and then they try to push them back into the populated area. So what the North Korea does with this, they would try to ask the South Koreans to join the war, but they refuse. And then with the Chinese entering the North Korean land, they are desperate now. So they threatened South Korea with some bombs, but they realized that's not going to work. So they would ask South Korea that they would be annexed by the South if they would help. So the South Koreans reluctantly joined the war against the Chinese. So with the help of South Korea, they were able to push back the Chinese out of the North Korean territory and back into the front line they were established. And then by this, with the South Korean aid, they would go back more into Manchuria, eventually splitting them off from the rest of China, and then getting them off of Manchuria, and then soon Taiwan would get liberated, and then Taiwan would start on a front line in the Strait of Taiwan, and then eventually capturing major cities like Shanghai and I don't know what else. But then they would start to climbing up, and then eventually they started to get all of their coast, managing to almost meet up with the North Koreans. And then with this, China is on the edge of collapse. And then soon, South Korea leaves the war. And then with this, they managed to connect into one big front with the North Koreans, and then eventually Beijing is being threatened, and then eventually Beijing falls. And then with this, China surrenders. So let's look at the peace treaty. So here's the peace treaty with China. The North Koreans managed to get Manchuria and a little bit of the coast of China, while Taiwan annexes the rest of China. The Central Asia countries, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Kyrgyzstan, and Tajikistan unite into one, and then they get nothing except for compensation, and the Vietnamese also gets a compensation, while Laos and Cambodia and Indonesia stopped being allies with North Korea, and also with Taiwan stopped being allies with North Korea. So South Korea decides to go over to North Korea and say that it's time to fulfill your word and to be annexed by the South. But the North Koreans got mad at this, and then they declare war on South Korea, proposing that they are sending threats. So with this, the world decides not to aid South Korea because they believe that the North was being threatened by the South. So with this, North Korean troops storm into the south, eventually capturing Seoul, and then they capture the mainland, and then they're exiled to this small island. And then a few years later go by, the Second Korean War decides to end right there. So let's look at the peace treaty. So here's the peace treaty. We see the full annexation of the South Korean mainland, and we see that the Republic of Korea being exiled to this small island, just like how Taiwan was exiled from its mainland from the Communist Party of China. So with this, they decide that they want to expand more. So they go over to Mongolia and ask them that could they help them invade Russia. So what they do is that they reluctantly accept, or they would get invaded. So with this, they declare war on Russia. And then with this, some of the Russian troops are starting to go to Siberia to fight off the North Koreans. But with this, they manage to have the advantage and start advancing into Russian territory. And Mongolia too. So they managed to capture this lake and then start to go up, and with the Russian winter sets in and they're slowly halted. And then the Central Asian countries start to come out too, and then soon they're all out, capturing the valuable part of Russia, and then soon any spearhead together goes over to Moscow. And then that's soon stalemated. So with this, with the Russian winter, it's at its peak, making the Russians able to push back the North Koreans and the Mongolians by a lot, back to their border. But then soon, a few months later go by, making the Russian winter go off again, and then they manage to get back to what they claimed. So with this, Moscow is finally captured, and then soon, eventually, a few months later, Russia surrenders. So let's look at the peace treaty. So here's the peace treaty with Russia. The Central Asian countries got nothing out of the war. Mongolia only got compensation, while North Korea is the only one that expanded surrounding Mongolia with its borders with Taiwan. So with this, they see Mongolia leaning towards the west more than itself, so they declare war on Mongolia and start an invasion into the Mongolian territory. So with the Mongolians being unprepared, they get destroyed automatically. So with this, this made the new China got mad, so they declare war on North Korea. And then with the advantage, they managed to push into the North Korean territory, capturing Beijing and started to go into the North Korean mainland, and then cut them off from the Korean peninsula from the Russian territory. And then with this, we see the North Koreans leaving Mongolia into China, and the Central Asian countries going into China as well. And then with a lot of land being lost in Taiwan, they still don't surrender yet. And then with this, Pyongyang falls, and then South Korea tries to go back to their land, and then soon they're split off, and then that part falls, and then they declare war on the rest of South Korea, and then the island falls over to the north, and then soon they do another encirclement, and then this part falls. And with Taiwan being extremely weak, they flee back to their island, and then soon, a few months of fighting, they decided to go to a peace deal. So let's look at the peace treaty. So here's the peace treaty with Taiwan. So we see the Republic of China still at its island, and we also see here that Central Asia has gone nothing this whole entire time. So they decided to rebel against the North Koreans, and then they declare war on North Korea. And then with the advantage of the North Koreans near the Taiwanese border, they started to advance soon into Mongolia and then reach up to this lake. And then soon they fully encase the lake, and then eventually the North Koreans arrive, and then they split them off, and then they manage to capture the troops at this lake, and then they push them back. So then with this, they're back into the border. They're now in Kazakhstan, and then now in Kyrgyzstan, and then finally in Tajikistan. And then soon, and a whole entire instability happens in the country, and then eventually Kazakhstan becomes communist, and then which makes the North Koreans easy to invade them. Soon Uzbekistan, and then Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, and then finally Turkmenistan surrenders. And then soon they realize that Vietnam has declared war. So, in anger, they decided to declare war on the whole entirety of Southeast Asia, bringing in Laos, Myanmar, Thailand, and Cambodia into the war. So with this, they managed to capture Hanoi very fast, and then soon they fall alongside with Laos and Cambodia. Soon Thailand falls, and then Myanmar falls. So let's look at the peace treaty. So here's the peace treaty with Central Asia and Southeast Asia. Here we see that the entirety of Central Asia got annexed, while the Southeast Asia got annexed also, while leaving behind a little bit of Thailand. And then with this, they request Malaysia to annex them, and that's what they do. Malaysia decides to annex the rest of Thailand, and then with this, they decide to conclude their empire, and now this is what they call the real Korean Empire, or the People's Democratic Republic of Korea. So hopefully y'all liked the video, and I'll see y'all in the next one.